record it. Go ahead and do it pretty safe. All right, guys, and I'm still letting some people in, but we're going to go ahead and get started. So our presentation starts, we like to start them right at 7, and tonight's is going to go till about 9 o'clock, and then we'll do some... and tonight we're going to go till about 9 o'clock because Erik has so much wonderful information for us, and tonight is all about birds. So we'll go ahead and get started. Erik, let me ask you this. Do you prefer for people to hold on to their questions, or would you like me to keep an eye on the chat? You want people to raise your hand? What's best for you?
Normally when I do this in person, I appreciate the conversation. Okay. I'll have some interactive questions too. Awesome. And I think maybe one way to deal with that is to maybe respond in chat. So if you know how to use the chat box, it's sort of at the bottom of your screen. I'll ask some questions. It'll be sort of like polls or whatever, right? Okay. Yeah, so I don't know. I mean, I'm happy to take questions throughout this. It might be a little bit awkward with 38 people. So maybe some kind of moderation, either through the chat box or raising a hand so somebody can speak their question in. We'll figure it out as we go, right?
All right, sounds good. Well, I'm gonna let you go ahead and take it.
Okay, so so 38 people, and I'm gonna try to cover everything I know about birds in 2 hours. And so it's going to be a lot, and I know it's evening and the middle of the week. And so the first poll, you can type in, you can practice your chat box use. How many people do you think are still going to be on this webinar at 9 o'clock when this ends? So we're putting down money. I have my number in my head. But seriously, thanks for joining, especially on your evening. I'm Erik Johnson. I'm Director of Bird Conservation for Audubon, Louisiana, which is a state office of the National Audubon Society. So I've been working with Audubon since 2011, focused on coastal restoration issues here in Louisiana, expanding our bird-friendly communities programming throughout the state. We have a project that we're trying to launch this winter potentially with purple martins as they're coming back next season. So that would be a new program that we're launching. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that work, but by and large, I really just want to sort of introduce to you all just the joy of birds, right? Why birds are so amazing, why they're special. I've been a birder basically since I could talk. And so it's been a lifelong passion and obsession, and I'm one of the lucky ones that I get to actually do this as part of my career. So first challenge is, all right, let's see. Okay. Oh, wow. People are optimistic. There's going to be 56 people at the end of this. We started with 41. That's a good one, Joelle. I like that. There's a realistic one. There's 10 people will be left. I'm going to try to, I cannot share my screen. It's not allowing me to. While we're waiting for that, I have a little bit of bird humor to get this kicked off. In the background here, there's an animal with a tag on it. Can everybody see that? The number is backwards. So the number is 19. And it's a crow, which is in the family Corvidae. So it's a Corvid-19. Too soon? There's going to be a lot of that tonight. All right. This is try to keep people awake. Shoot. Just when I think I have it all figured out. What can people see?
Royal terns.
Okay, and it's not the presenter view. It's the whole shebang.
Yeah, just one slide.
Yeah, no slides on the side. Okay. Okay. Well, I will get started. This will be your next chance to enter in answers into the chat box. Here we go. Okay, so most of you are probably familiar with this bird, right? It's the state bird of Louisiana, the brown pelican. It's a bird that's come back from basically extinction in Louisiana. In the 1960s, it was no longer found in Louisiana as a nesting bird. But today, because of recovery efforts and the banning of DDT and institutional laws like the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which we just learned yesterday, will stand as it was originally written. So the Trump administration's proposal to gut part of that legislation was overturned by the courts. So that's a big win for birds. This is one of the birds that has benefited from laws like that. So what is a bird? I have 5 answers here. What is unique to birds that is really found in no other group? I'll give you a couple seconds to type in your answers. Let's see if I can find the chat box. Okay, there's the chat box.
Yeah.
All right, feathers. We got lots of feathers in here. Good. Wings. Well, okay, bats have wings. Dragonflies have wings. Hollow bones, that's 2. The beak, there we go. It's got a really unique beak without teeth. That's keratinized. That's really unique to birds and no other group. Reduced genitalia, I'm not going to answer that with the way I want to, but it's actually, there are lots of different kinds of organisms that have reduced genitalia. Evolved from reptiles, so did mammals. So we're still up to 3. Warm-blooded, so we're mammals. Okay, so you got 3 of the 5, and that's usually where most groups go. Air sacs, that's a good one. All right, that's a really good one, and I'll get back to that. So we got the feathers, the hollow bones, the bill without teeth. The furcula is actually unique to birds. It's a fused collarbone. That's basically the wishbone of a, if you ever play that game at Thanksgiving. That furcula is really springy, and that interacts with the muscle system called the enlarged coracoideus, which is essentially like the back shoulder muscles. But in birds, it has a unique physiology, and it wraps around the furcula in such a way that when the coracoideus is contracting and spreading the wings, the furcula is expanding and providing sort of like the springing action to help the muscles power flight. And so if you were to take a cross section of a bird, this is basically what it would look like. So again, you have that supracoracoideus muscle wrapping around the furcula, and then that's interacting also with the pectoralis muscle. And in birds, this supracortical, in most birds, I should say, not all of them, not ostriches, but for most flight-capable birds, the coracoideus and the pectoralis represent about 1/3 of the bird's body weight. So there's a good reason why people can't fly, and this is one of them, is that we just don't have the big muscles to relative to the rest of our weight to power flight. There's been lots of other really important adaptations that have facilitated flight in birds. They've done it differently than other kinds of organisms. So one really obvious example of this is just that they've reduced the number of bones. What Aimee said also about the reduced genitalia is also related to this, right? Everything that they could shrink in order to allow for flight, that is evolved in the avian lineages over millennia. And so, our dexterity in our hands are very, very valuable, but that's a lot of bones. That's more than what you would need in order to fly. And so birds have basically lost a lot of the fine, intricate bone structures of the hand and the wrist. And somebody also mentioned the hollow bones, I believe, right? So they have this cross section, and they're not completely hollow. They're actually supported through these vertical sutures, or vertical structures that basically are really, really powerful. Like if you were to crush a pencil by trying to push down on it, you would have a very hard time doing it. If you snapped it from the side, it's much easier. But these vertical structures are basically acting like a series of really strong pencils inside the bone. And of course, what makes birds just so remarkable is their feathers, right? It's what we see. It is what gives them their plumage. It's what makes them attractive to mates. It's a really important form of communication from one bird to another. It's very visual, intricate in many cases, like this northern flicker. These intricate patterns are just incredible, especially when you can see some of these birds up close. And this diagram here just shows the 10 what we call primary feathers of the outer wing in a northern flicker. All the wing feathers together we call remiges. The tail feathers we call rectrices. The body feathers we call contour feathers. So there's lots of technical terms that are associated with the parts of birds that we don't often use in our common vernacular. But as you get into birds and read about birds, this sort of new language will become, just like any taxon, somewhat, of a learning hurdle is just learning the taxonomy of these names. And then within each feather is just this fascinating array of structure that most of which you can really only see under a microscope. So the tail and flight feathers are long and paddle shaped. They have a hollow shaft running down the middle that's called a rachis. Off of the rachis are barbs, and each of those barbs have barbules that run 90 degrees off of them, and each of those barbules have hooklets. So there's basically 4 different, crossing structures that essentially act like Velcro and allow the birds to zip those feathers back into place. So when a bird is actually preening itself, it's running its bill through its feathers. It's not only cleaning the debris and parasites and things like that off of its plumage, but it's actually zipping these feathers back into place. Feathers perform an incredibly important function. They not just power flight or display information, but they're also the thermoregulatory agent for the bird. So a bird can actually trap heat by locking those feathers together, and then they can open up their feathers and puff out their feathers and actually allow hot air to escape. So, these body feathers serve both as sort of a rain jacket, as a winter jacket, but also as like a t-shirt, just depending on how they have them positioned on their body. And each individual feather can be controlled through their musculature. Then you have lots of other kinds of feathers that are important for display, like phyloplumes and various bristles and other sort of specialized things that some birds have evolved to include into their plumage. So this is, just more taxonomy of the body parts, more topography. So the wing is really probably one of the more complex portions of the bird, and just in terms of the feather names. There are scapulars that are along the body. You have a series of coverts running down the wing called the lesser coverts, the median coverts, and the greater coverts. Those coverts are collectively called secondary coverts, and they cover the secondaries. So these inner 9 feathers of the wing in songbirds are called secondaries, and often the inner 3 are referred to as tertials. The outer flight feathers are called primaries. You have primary coverts that cover those primaries. You have olulas, which is the set of 3 or 4 feathers here on the leading edge of the wing. So anyway, it's I don't think we'll have a quiz at the end of this, but if we were, this would be a diagram on it, right? So as you're getting into ornithology and reading through the literature, this is some of the terminology that you learn. And of course, really, like I mentioned before, no other no other animal on the planet has feathers, no other living animal. But as somebody mentioned in the chat dialogue, birds did in fact evolve from reptiles, from a very specific set of reptiles. And the way that is currently hypothesized in terms of how feathers evolved were basically from these scales or spines that grew out of the skin of early reptiles. And at first, the thought is that those spines were hollow, much like the rachis of a bird is today. And that spine grows out of a follicle, so a set of cells that are arranged in a circular pattern that grow upward, much like the stem of a plant. And in order to convert that into a feather, you would have to differentiate across those cells in the follicle. And each one of those ridges, those barb ridges, would create different sort of structures of the feather. And through more complications, you could create follicles that create different kinds of feathers, like the remiges, the rectrices, body feathers, down feathers, and so on and so forth. So in modern birds, if you examine these follicles under a microscope, you can see exactly how they're arranged here. And it's not too big of a leap to follow these steps through evolutionary time. And in fact, we're learning more and more from early birds and from their ancient relatives that this hypothesis so far has been supported. Another really unique part of birds that somebody mentioned is in fact the respiratory system. So they have these air sacs, and most birds have 9 of them. And this makes them really, really efficient at extracting oxygen out of the air. So every time we take a deep breath in and breathe out, all we've done is we've mixed the same air going in and out, right? Our lungs are actually pretty inefficient at expelling carbon dioxide, and it mixes with the oxygen that we're bringing into our lungs. The way that birds do it, though, is when they breathe in, the air doesn't go directly to their lungs, it goes to a sac. And as they breathe out, that first breath of air moves into their lungs. Then they breathe in again, that first breath of air moves to another set of sacs. And then on their second exhale, that air is expelled. And so this creates only a single direction of air moving across their alveoli, within their lungs. Whereas we have 2 directions, right? It's going in and out in the same pathway. But because birds can sort of move the air across their lungs in this fashion, they're much more efficient at getting oxygen out of the air and into their blood, which again, powers flight. It's a very lightweight system. And there is another type of organism that once lived on the planet that is thought to have also had this respiratory system, and that's the dinosaurs, or at least a certain set of dinosaurs, like the T-Rex, like the Velociraptor. And the way that we know this is that in modern birds, we can look at where those air sacs sit up against the skeletal system, and it has this very unique sort of scarring pattern. And that exact same pattern is found in the fossil records of certain dinosaurs, particularly theropod dinosaurs. And so that's a really good piece of evidence that birds are in fact dinosaurs. The dinosaurs did not go extinct. That birds are just the remnant of their existence. So this is what we call a phylogenetic tree that shows the relationship of birds with other kinds of organisms, and in this case, reptiles. So, birds are actually not very closely related to the pterosaurs, the pterodactyls, the flying the flying dinosaurs. It's a very different group of animals. They're more closely related to like brontosaurus, and even within that group, they're more closely related to like I said, like Velociraptor and T-Rex. So what happens when the dinosaurs go extinct? Who are the birds most closely related to? Turns out the closest living relative to birds is crocodiles and alligators. And in fact, alligators and birds are more closely related to each other than alligators are to other reptiles. Let that sink in for a second. Right, so birds and crocodiles are more closely related to each other than crocodiles are to other reptiles. So this is another way of looking at the relationship of vertebrates, right? So here are birds and reptiles. Can y'all see my pointer if I move it? Yeah, all right. So this node right here indicates a shared ancestor between crocodiles and birds. This node indicates a shared ancestor between the scaled reptiles, crocodiles, and birds. Basically going back in time. You go all the way back to the fishes. So there's a term that phylogeny and phylogeneticists, excuse me, and taxonomists like to use. And they're obsessed about groups of organisms being monophyletic. And that word basically means that all animals in that group are more closely related to each other than they are to any other animal. So for example, all of the birds are more closely related to other birds than they are to any other kind of animal. All of the mammals, right? From duck-billed platypus to gorillas to humans to rabbits, we are all more closely related to each other than we are to amphibians or turtles or birds or anything else. Okay. Same thing with frogs and salamanders. They are all more closely related to each other. So I think I've made that point. The contradiction to monophyly is paraphyly. So that's when you create a group that are not each other's closest relatives. So in this case, the class Reptilia is paraphyletic, right? The crocodiles are more closely related to birds than they are to anything else. But this group of Reptilia is paraphyletic. It is a taxonomic problem. This class Reptilia should not exist in terms of the rules of phylogenetics. So this is another opportunity to put in or to ask questions or raise your hand. How would we fix this? How can we make this group of reptiles monophyletic? And there's a few ways of doing it. How would you make monophyly out of this problem? All right, move reptiles with aves. Right, so you could create one big group of all the reptiles with the birds, and then you'd have to basically argue over whether all of that is reptilia or all of that is class aves. You could move the crocodiles and the birds into one group, right? And that would be a monophyletic group. Maybe that's class aves. You could create 4 separate groups. Turtles are their own class, scaled reptiles being their own class, crocodiles their own class, birds being their own class. Anyway, there's lots of ways to do it. And so far, taxonomists have not been willing to create a new system of classes to reorganize these organisms. They're stuck in this system of paraphyly. So if you go to like an ornithological conference, you might see a talk sort of like this, right? Herpetology is the study of reptiles and amphibians. It's a silly field, right? Reptiles are more closely related to birds and mammals than they are to amphibians. So we should break this all up and fold all the lizards into ornithology, right? So we create this new group, which makes sense, right? And there's an ornithological conference right now and going on virtually, and this could very easily be one of the talks. But if you go to a herpetology conference, you might see a talk like this. And I'm not saying that one of these is true and one of these are not. They're very likely both true. All right, moving on. So we can trace back the origin of birds to about 150 million years ago. And that was through this very famous fossil known as Archaeopteryx. And in fact, if you look very closely at the sort of solidified mud around the bones, you can actually see the feather imprints. So this was a feathered organism. And if you were to take an artist rendition, it would look something like this. It had a bony tail, it had teeth, it still had claws on its wings. So it wasn't fully bird-like, but it actually had the jaw characteristics that is consistent with modern birds and not with dinosaurs or other reptiles. It had feathers, it had a respiratory system like birds, and so this is really considered that missing link between birds and reptiles. And the world was a very different place 150 million years ago. The continents were in a different position. They're actually much more closely positioned to each other than they are today. And that facilitated a lot of dispersal during this period. And so all of the continents basically became occupied by these early bird-like dinosaurs. And of course, over the next 80 million years or so, so over the next 80 million years, you had this incredible diversification of birds. And all of these different groups of birds were establishing themselves. They were dispersing across these continents. This red line includes the lineage of modern birds, but something really important happened 65 million years ago. Does anyone know what that is? Chat box time. Giant meteor. Yes, and it hit in the Gulf of Mexico and wiped out 99% of the life on the planet. There's actually a lot of really interesting research going on into this event right now. I was taught, growing up in grade school and high school and even college, that this was a really slow extinction. The Earth darkened with soot, and it took years and years and years for all this stuff to get killed off. Probably most of it happened within the first few hours. This created, basically, it rained glass around the world because of the heat and the molten lava that got spewed up into the air and then hardened. Basically killed most of the life almost instantaneously within a couple of days. Just remarkable, some of the evidence that people are finding about this. And the world was very different then, right? Compared to 150 million years ago. It's much more like it was today in terms of the position of the continents. So now all of these creatures that once existed across the world went extinct, and whatever did survive remained isolated from each other by the oceans. And so what happened was, in terms of birds, most of the birds got wiped out too. There was only really one small group of birds that survived. And they were, dispersed across these different continents in relative isolation and never had the chance to re-meet with each other. And then you had, after, in the last 65 million years, you had this incredible diversity again of that remaining group of birds. And so all 11,000 species of modern birds basically evolved from this one lineage of birds, and the rest of them all died off. And it's also the reason why, it explains why when you go to different continents, you find all of these different groups of birds that are completely unrelated to each other, but they have the same niche. So these are all insect-eating birds that are completely unrelated to each other, found on different continents. So in US and in North America, we have warblers, right? The bright yellow birds, very familiar birds, one of the most popular birds that people go to see during migration. But warblers are very much a North American specialty. There are very few in South America. There are none in the Old World. And they get replaced by other kinds of birds. In Australia, they have these fairy wrens. In South America, they have antbirds. So all these different kinds of birds have evolved in isolation from each other. And it's one of the reasons why not only birds, but really any sort of interest in naturalism and wildlife, that's what makes it so exciting to go travel the world, is you get to see this consequence of millions and millions and millions of years of evolution and isolation. And so, yeah, it's just really fascinating. And for those of you who've ever traveled in some of these places, it's just a totally different world when you go to one of these different continents. So I'm going to talk a little bit about bird watching, like the joy of actually getting out there and seeing the birds. And obviously during COVID, we're all under travel restrictions and whatnot, but bird watching is something you can do anywhere. And you can, do it in your backyard, do it in your local park. You don't have to drive anywhere. You don't even have to really go anywhere. Just pull out a chair in your backyard and enjoy it. And actually, a lot of what we know about birds comes from bird watchers over the last 200 years. The field of ornithology as a profession has really grown in the last 50 years, but most of the baseline distributions, the species, a lot of that was contributed by amateur citizen community ornithologists. So if you open a field guide, which is usually one of the first things you do when you get into bird watching, you buy a book that tells you about the different birds of your area, you'll often find, again, more terminology that has to be learned. But it's a really important set of terminology because it allows bird watchers to communicate with each other about what they're seeing. It's like, oh, what color is the median crown stripe? Is it gray or is it white? Turns out that's actually important for identifying certain species of sparrow. So there will be a quiz at the end on this, so make sure you memorize all this right now and go. All right, no, I'm just kidding, there won't be any quiz. So when you're out there identifying birds, I think one of the most important things to carry with you is not binoculars, it's not a camera, it is a notebook and a pencil. Really intelligent or skilled or experienced birders, it's not even so much about experience, but savvy birders immediately recognize how, can identify things to groups just based on the way that birds move. So a warbler and a vireo and a kinglet are all small little birds that are yellow or olive or whatever. But they move differently. And so taking notes on what you're seeing and describing how high in the tree they are, what their foraging behavior like, are they stopping and they peck, or are they constantly flitting around? Those are really important. Those behavioral aspects is really important for birds. And that will often get you to the family or the group of birds faster than the plumage itself. So lots of birds can be, different kinds of birds can be all yellow, but they move differently. And so that becomes really important. And of course, once you do get it to the family, and this is the warblers again that I mentioned before, you have lots of variations, and it's not just across species, it can be between different sexes. Males and females look different. Sometimes adults and immatures look different, and sometimes they look different across different times of the year. So the winter plumage can be very different from the summer plumage. And of course, if you have reasonably good ears, listen. If you just sort of stand there quietly and listen to the world, you'll start to hear birds that you didn't know existed. So in terms of picking out birds, bill shape is really important. So just like behavior, bill shape can get you to the group of birds or the family of birds faster than the plumage in a lot of cases. So some of these are the really obvious ones, but even I'm sure almost all of you, right? Probably all of you, even if you're not a birder, can pick out several birds from just the silhouette, right? And with practice and with skill, you can pick out all of these. Every single one of these you can get to, if not species, then probably genus on all of these birds. So number 22, let's use the chat box again. Does anyone know 22? Lots of cardinals. All right. Yes, 22 is a cardinal. How about number 5?
I wish I could.
Yep, long skinny bill. Hummingbird. Very good. All right, this is for the experts in the group. I think Joelle might, if she's on. How about number 10? Kismet. All right. It is a great crested flycatcher. Yeah, some of you got it. Good, 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 good. So, I mean, that just seems completely arbitrary and obscure, but it, you know, with practice, like I said, it can happen. Number 9. How about number 9?
You. I don't get it.
Yeah, woodpecker. So, yeah, you get the point, right? So, we haven't even looked at plumage yet, and so there's a lot of important features beyond plumage.
Cute.
From branch to branch.
Here's another set of examples. So the bill can also tell you a lot about what birds eat, like what they do. So the bill here on the left of these 3 birds is kind of thin and pointy and long. These are insect-eating bills, and you can even see differences across these 3 different kinds, right? So there's a long one with the hook at the top. It's kind of a medium-sized one, and then there's a little teeny stubby teeny bill. I don't know how else to describe it. And on the right, you have a series of seed-crushing bills. Notice at the base of the bill, they have this little notch, right? This really shows up well on the bottom right picture. It has this notch, and that's perfect for crushing or cutting open seeds. The thickness of the bill also gives them the power to do so. But even so, the length of the bills are different, the relative width. And so that gets you to family. So very quickly, if you're focusing on bills, you can get vireos, warblers, and kinglets separated, and you can get finches, blackbirds, and sparrows separated. Beyond plumage, right? Plumage can be confusing, but bills are often very, very helpful. All right, another opportunity to use your chat box. How many species of birds are on this slide? And I will give you a hint. It is not 0. It is not 5. All right, we got a lot of votes for 1. We got some votes for 2. Another vote for 1. Well, some of you are right and some of you aren't. It is actually 2. And then the next question is, which 2 are the same and which 2 are different? So the options are, I guess, are the top 2 the same, the bottom 2 the same? So across, or the vertical, or the diagonal? Diagonal, horizontal. A lot of people saying diagonal, vertical. Yeah, this is awful. I'm kind of a jerk for putting this in front of y'all. So I appreciate you being sporting about it. It is actually the diagonal, right? So the upper left and bottom right are the same. Upper right, lower left are the same. Yeah. And this is a really, really tricky group. They have the same bill shape. They're in the same family. The plumage is very, very subtly different. And I'm not giving you the full image of the bird either. One of the tricks with these species is actually the undertail coverings. And only in this one picture can you kind of see it. It's whitish, the orange crown is kind of yellowish. But that aside, we are in the month of August, and if you were to see a bird that looks like one of these 2, just based on the range map that would be in one of your field guides, you'd be able to figure out which one it is. So the Tennessee warbler is a migrant that comes through the area, maybe a little early in August, but in the next few weeks it'll be coming through. But the orange-crowned warbler is only here in the winter. And so there's no way we'd see an orange-crowned warbler in August or September. They come later. So these maps in your field guides are really, really, really helpful in sort of eliminating a whole bunch of possibilities. But the maps are even somewhat ambiguous, right? What is winter? What is summer? We don't even have seasons in Louisiana, right? So, I mean, what does this even mean? And it is vague, but there's a really useful tool out there. And I'm going to come back to this a few times. And this is a tool called eBird. It's ebird.org, and it is bird watching data. So you, me, anybody can go out and go look at birds and keep track of what they see, and then they can enter it into this online data portal. And it gathers all of this information and it can create these outputs. And so now it has week by week by week the frequency at which bird watchers are reporting these species. And it's all sort of administered by review teams that volunteer their time to make sure the records are as accurate as they can be. So you know when you're looking at stuff like this that it's pretty likely to be true. And so if we're in, you know, the second half of August, definitely there's only bird it could be was Tennessee warbler. You have a couple periods of the year, a couple weeks of the year where you might get both, and that's where it gets really tricky. And there's no shame in reporting warbler spuh, so you don't know which kind of warbler it is. So in this case, how does a bird go from one plumage to the other? Right? So feathers are actually inert. Once they're grown, they don't really change. They can only change through the wearing down of the plumage, or they physically have to be replaced. And it turns out that's what's going on in this situation, and we call that molt. So when they schedule the replacement of their feathers at certain times of the year, that's called molt. So I'm going to explain a little bit about bird molt. It's actually one of my favorite subjects in ornithology. I've written several papers about it. It's really understudied. It's poorly understood. Most bird watchers don't really sort of think about it too much, except they realize that birds kind of change plumage from season to season. But it's a really fascinating area. I mean, the feathers are so important. So I'm going to try to explain it, and this is what I think I look like. I apologize if I sort of get to this stage, because I get really excited about bird molt. So what is molt, right? Fundamentally, it is just the regular and predictable replacement of feathers, which means it's scheduled. It has to happen at certain times of the year and in a certain pattern. In birds, it probably originated in birds. Lots of other organisms actually do something similar. They shed their skin. Horseshoe rabbits will change their fur seasonally. Even lizards will shed their skin, but fundamentally it's a different process than what birds do. Crocodiles, the closest living relative to birds, don't shed their scales the way that birds do. Crocodiles shed like one scale kind of here and there throughout the year. It's much more random. So the origin of avian molt, we can't really look to other species to understand. It's only within birds and presumably within some of the dinosaurs, which we know nothing about molt in dinosaurs. So why do they do it? Well, feathers fade and they wear through time, right? They brush up against vegetation, they get exposed to sunlight, so they lose their structural integrity and their attractiveness to mates. And so the timing, the frequency, the duration, and how many feathers, the extent of molts, are presumably optimized to deal with these sort of environmental and social pressures. So it's very, very important. It's probably one of the most important life phases of a bird. Not every single bird breeds every year. Not every single bird migrates, but every single bird molts and annually. So it's fundamentally important to birds. And one example, one group of birds will do it this way, right? So a little baby bird hatches out of its eggs in the nest, and pretty quickly, that baby bird will grow in its first set of feathers. And so we call that the juvenile plumage. And that bird will leave the nest and enter the world Word is at risk to predation, to heat stress, to cold stress, to parasites, whatever, right? And that juvenile plumage, because they grew it so quickly, is actually a really terrible plumage. It was good at getting the bird out of the nest, but it's not a very effective plumage to wear for the rest of the year. So many, many birds actually replace that juvenile plumage very soon after they leave the nest. So if the breeding season is summer, like May, June, July, August and September is the molting season. So when you look at birds right now, and some of you probably have cardinals coming to your feeders, and they have like bald heads, maybe with like one little feather sticking out, that's a bird going through its molt at this time of year. But, immatures will replace some of those feathers, and they'll wear those feathers through the winter, and then in the spring, they will actually replace some of those feathers again. And many bird watchers know this as the breeding plumage, right? They come back in the spring and they look beautiful. They look very different than they did in the fall. And then they have their reproductive season. And after the reproductive season, it'll go through a complete molt. So again, these are these little cardinals right now with like the two feathers sticking out of their heads. And they'll wear that through the winter. And then in the spring, they'll replace some of their plumage again. And so on and so forth, the rest of the bird. And many, many, many birds that people are familiar with, some of the most beautiful birds on the planet, and particularly migratory birds, have that sort of system where they molt in the fall, they molt in the spring. Other kinds of birds don't do a spring molt. So otherwise, it's exactly the same. They have their baby, plumage, the juvenile plumage, they come out of the nest, they replace that, but then they wear it the rest of the year, including into their first breeding season. Breeding season, they do go through a complete molt, and they wear that the entire year. So some birds do that. And it turns out many of those birds are resident birds, non-migratory birds, things like cardinals and chickadees, wrens, mockingbirds. So this is a question for the chat box. So going back to migratory birds, why do migratory birds have this spring molt, but non-migratory birds don't? Jane. I didn't know Jane was here. Hi, Jane. Sorry, Jane. All right, higher chance of feather damage. Jane responded, they need strong feathers for migration. It's everybody's first instinct, but it's actually unrelated because it's usually not the flight feathers that get replaced. It's only body feathers. So the migratory birds are replacing body feathers, but not feathers that they need to fly. Prettier for attracting mates, maybe, but the females also do it, and she remains dull in plumage. Heating, cooling, you're sort of getting at it there, yep. Chance of feather damage, and it turns out, some of you are on the right track. Yeah, so it turns out that migratory birds follow the summer, which means that throughout their life, they're experiencing longer day lengths. A resident bird goes through a winter and it experiences shorter day lengths. So a resident bird on average in its entire life will see 12 hours of daylight. A migratory bird might see 14, 15, 18 hours of daylight on average throughout its life. And it's that increased ultraviolet pressure on the feathers that is thought to drive the evolution of that spring molt. And then some birds like warblers and grosbeaks and tanagers have adapted by adding, like the males will add colorful plumage to that. So that's a secondary reason for the molts, but the primary reason is basically the exposure to ultraviolet light, right? If you leave your windshield wipers on your car for too long, they break down over time. And it's largely because of ultraviolet light breaking it down. So, and other birds will go through seasonal changes too, and you'll see this in your field guides. But some birds have figured out how to do this through the wear of their feathers. So in both this case of the eastern meadowlark and the European starling, the pale tips of the feathers actually break off in the spring, revealing the beautiful undercoat. So they actually don't go through a spring molt, even though they look different in the spring. It's just done through the process of wear. So there's different ways that birds can kind of change their plumages seasonally. It makes the whole thing fairly complex, but just a basic understanding of it, I think, really does help bird watchers sort of understand and what to expect from season to season. So in terms of field guides, I often get the question, which one is the best? Which is the best field guide? Well, the best one is the one that you have handy, that you use. So for me, it's all of them. I have a whole bookshelf full of field guides, and they all have different benefits, advantages, pros and cons. So here's a couple of examples. The Crosley guide on the left, this is obviously photoshopped, but it is a wonderful representation of how you're likely to see that bird, right? So this is a black scoter, a sea duck. They're often seen in large flocks offshore. It's a real, you can kind of see how the flock structure is formed. But if you're looking for other similar birds, you have to flip through a lot of pages. So it tells you a little bit about the bird, but isn't necessarily the easiest field guide, but it is a useful guide. The Peterson guide is often one that gets recommended to entry-level bird watchers because it shows a lot of the similar species on the same page, and it has the arrows that point you to the plumage features that are distinctive for that bird. So the Peterson guide is a good one. The National Geographic guide is very similar, lots of pictures on the same page. Another place, another thing you might want to know once we get out of COVID, especially, is where to go birding, right? There's this wonderful Birder's Guide to Louisiana. You can actually get it as a free PDF. Maybe I can put this in the chat box. Or actually, maybe I can recruit Jane or Joelle to do that. Put a link to the PDF of this in the chat box. And again, you can really just go bird watching anywhere, but this is a nice guide to kind of give you where some of the really popular places are in Louisiana that really have a lot of birds. So then, then actually the second most important tool beyond your notebook is the binocular. And all binoculars will have these two numbers. The first number is the magnification, so it's basically the bigger the number, the more magnification, the bigger things will look. And the second number is what's called the objective lens length. I think of it in terms of the field of view. So usually the bigger the number, the wider the field of view. And for bird watching, most birders prefer a 1:4 or 1:5 ratio. And an 8x42, for example, has a brighter and broader field of view than an 8x32. An 8x32 is great if you're mostly looking at birds as your feeder. You know where your feeder is. You can always find it easily. But if you're looking for a small bird jumping through the trees in a forest, you want a broader field of view. An 8x42 will also let in more light than an 8x32. And so that becomes an advantage as well. I personally like the 10 magnification. Some people have a hard time holding it steady. And then of course you have, like with songbirds in a tree, you might have more challenges in sort of honing in on the bird because the increased magnification has the trade-off of a slightly narrow field of view. So an 8x40 versus an 8x40 versus 10x40. An 8x40 has a wider field of view, but less magnification. So those are just all sorts of trade-offs. And in terms of price, you get what you pay for. You can buy a perfectly decent binocular out of a plastic box at Walmart for like 25 bucks. If you bump it once or twice, the lenses will start to come out of alignment. You won't have a clear view anymore. And you could pay $3,000 for a pair of binoculars if you wanted to. And those things you can run over with the truck. They have a lifetime warranty. And there's a number of really, really, really nice binoculars in the $500 to $1,000 range. $100 to $200 to $300 will get you something really good. But you get what you pay for. Most major companies have lifetime warranties on their binoculars now, which is really, really great. Because we like to abuse them. One of the tricks to using them is don't look for birds with your binoculars, look for birds with your eyes. And then when you see the subject, don't move your head, but quickly lift your binoculars up to where your head is. And you don't see your bird within 2 seconds, take your binoculars down and look for it again, because the bird could have jumped or be hidden behind a leaf or something like that. It'll just help you sort of figure them out a little bit quicker. Poro versus roof prism. The Poro prism is sort of an older style. Usually they're less durable and a little bit more bulky, but often a little bit less expensive for the same optical quality. Roof prisms are really popular now because they're small, they're compact, they're really durable, slightly more expensive for the optical quality. But again, sort of, these sort of trade-offs. So once you're out there looking for birds, seeing birds, you probably want to start keeping track of what you see. Particularly as a naturalist, your observations matter. They can actually be used for science. In the old days, and my parents got me one of these when I was 11, was a book with all of the birds of the United States, and you could check the box when you've seen it and write in the date when you saw it and where you saw it, and I still have that from like 30 years ago. But nowadays, eBird is like the central database and everybody can contribute to it. So it's all online on ebird.org. You can submit your observations. There's an app actually which you can use in the field and punch in your bird counts and your species sightings in real time, and it will upload it to the database. So it's a really, really cool tool. And I'll show you one of the nuances that it provides, like I mentioned with the Tennessee and Orange Crown Warbler situation. So here's one of the most glorious birds in the world, really. The oh my God bird, the painted bunting. These are actually fairly common in Louisiana. If you have not seen one, there are a lot of good places to go to see them. Along the Batcher, along the Mississippi River can be really good for them. In migration, going to Grand Isle. It's a fairly common bird, and it's here in the summer. In December to February, this map, right, which you might find in one of your field guides, says it's gone, right? It goes to the tropics for the winter. But look at the eBird map. This is December to February, and there are records all over South Louisiana. So what's going on here? Maybe it's climate change. Maybe the maps are out of date. Probably more likely is that painted buntings have always been here in really low numbers. And more experienced birders, more birders out there in the world. It's one of the fastest growing outdoor pastimes over the last 20 years. We're just finding more of them. Could be partially driven by climate change, like I said. But eBird shows the very specific details of where birds are and when they're there. So I was encouraged to suggest a couple of ideas for you all to get credit hours related to bird watching. So one of them, and you can coordinate with me offline, coordinate with Janelle, with any of your master naturalist leaders. So one of these options is to go out bird watching for a minimum of 1 hour and contribute a complete checklist to eBird. A complete checklist means that you've recorded all the birds that you can identify by sight and sound. In this checklist, you should record the distance you traveled, even if that distance is 0. There's a way to do a stationary list. And how much time you spent. So whether it's an hour and 3 minutes, 3 hours, whatever. But for the credit, do at least an hour of continuous bird watching. And there's a comment section when you can submit your list. Add the weather conditions. So temperature, cloud cover, wind. Those are the sort of important ones. Any other relevant notes that you think might be useful. And if you've seen at least 5 species on that list, add species-specific comments. So what was it doing? What kind of tree was it foraging in? Was it singing? Was it, what was its behavior? What are some of the details of the plumage? But add some comments, right? Take out your notebook and really observe some of the birds that are out there around you. I would encourage you to do at least 1 photo and/or 1 audio recording, and you can submit that to the list as well. If you don't have a camera or a way to record, that's okay. All right, so that's one option. Not everybody is going to want to do eBird. So another option is to submit bird records to iNaturalist. iNaturalist is another really great online database for everything nature. So this might be more appropriate for people who don't necessarily know their birds, but have the ability to take pictures of them. And the great thing about this is that every single record that gets submitted has the opportunity to be verified by an expert or by another member of the iNaturalist community. And it's all confirmed through photographs or audio recordings. And again, scientists use these data to understand distributions and patterns and phenologies of different kinds of plants and animals. If you do take the photos, crop them down. Don't just take a little blurry photo with your iPhone and stick it up there and expect somebody to be able to identify it. Try to crop it down a little bit. Make sure you have your date and time stamp and your camera correct. And that's it. So try to get 5 different species. They don't have to be all on the same day or the same place, but submit the five different records. And ideally, all of them will get verified within the first few days of submitting them. With birds and with a few other organisms like frogs, it's actually really, really useful to learn how to use the audio systems, the recording systems, if you have a smartphone. Most smartphones these days have excellent recording capabilities. I've installed an app on mine called RecForge Lite. It's a free program, and it actually allows me to boost the input gain. So if something is kind of soft, I can boost the input gain and it actually sounds louder in the phone. I download and I process all of my audio with Audacity. It's another free program that you can download on your computer. And I try to filter out some of the background noise using these filters. They're called high pass filters or low pass filters. And you can export the audio file as an MP3. It's really easy to submit those MP3s to eBird or to iNaturalist. So that's your challenge for the bird component of your Master Naturalist training. Is to either submit an eBird list or to submit several iNaturalist records. And if you have any questions, you can feel free to reach out to me or Janelle or any of your leaders. All right, and this is one of the values of contributing to eBird, is that the geniuses over there at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology that manage the database, they can create these incredible maps of week-by-week patterns in bird migration. So this is the eastern phoebe, a very common bird here in the winter. I mean, it's just like you could waste a whole Sunday afternoon just scrolling through all the different birds and checking out the migration patterns. So speaking of migration, that's one of the most fascinating things about birds, is their ability to traverse huge distances, continents, hemispheres. And they do it because of food and because of the drive to breed. They need to survive and they need to reproduce in order to pass on their genes. And not all migration is the same in birds. It's actually evolved many, 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 many different times across different kinds of birds. So by nature, there's just different types of avian migration. The most common one that we think about is what we call complete or obligate migration. So that's usually what we think of in terms of latitude. So birds from Louisiana in the summer, they go south to the tropics in the winter, and then they come back the following spring. Some birds are also elevational migrants. They go up and down mountains. This is actually very common in like the Andes of South America and mountain ranges in Central America. But there's some US birds that do this too, like gray jays and some of the rosy finches in the Rocky Mountains. They're elevational migrants. There's another kind of migration called partial, where some individuals don't migrate, but others do. And brown pelicans are an example of that. Most of our brown pelicans stay in the Gulf Coast in the winter, but some actually migrate to Central America. And then there's eruptive migrations. And unfortunately, we don't get a lot of this in Louisiana, but snowy owls and some of the northern finches like purple finch, pine siskin, they're really classic eruptive. So you have these huge annual fluctuations in food availability. And in the boom years, they reproduce like crazy and they don't migrate. They just take advantage of the food. And then you have a food crash. And you have all these animals there out in the world that need to go find food. And so they migrate south in those years when this food crashes. But it's not predictable. Sometimes it's not even very seasonal. But it can be really, really interesting. And there's some folks who have really been able to do a good job, at least year to year, predicting which species are going to erupt based on the cone crop production in the boreal forest each year. And some birds, like hawks, they migrate during the day. They take advantage of the power of the sun that's actually warming, bouncing off the earth, creating these thermals, and they take advantage of these thermals, they rise up, and then they peel off, and they drift. They don't have to flap their wings all day long. They just basically take advantage of the thermals and the currents. Other birds, like many songbirds, they migrate at night. They flap. They have to power their flight. And in fact, maybe not so much this month, but come September, October, November, on those nights where you get a full moon and it's after a cold front, put your binoculars or a telescope up against the moon and you can actually see birds migrating at night. It's usually much more blurry than this. They just go zipping across the moon. But you can actually see birds flying overhead at night against the moon. And a lot of different kinds of birds do this, like I mentioned, like hummingbirds and ducks, and buntings and gulls and hawks. And this map shows 121 different species. This is the sort of centroid of each of those species distribution. And look at even in South America, right? There's birds that migrate there too. And literally as the earth is revolving around the sun, and because of its tilt, these migratory birds are following the summer. This wave of animal movement across the Western Hemisphere is just fascinating. And then if you look at Louisiana, look how many of those are coming through Louisiana. We're in a really, really exciting place to witness bird migration. And if you can't get out there in person to see it, you can actually see it at your desktop. You can see the radar systems showing bird migration. So this map shows with each of these pluses is a radar station that has the capacity of detecting bird migration. And you often see it in this sort of donut pattern because of the angle of the radar beam. There's a certain distance once it gets to an elevation where it picks up the birds that are migrating, even though they probably are also migrating right over the radar. It's just the angle of the beam isn't picking them up. So this is an example of a spring migration of birds crossing the Gulf of Mexico, arriving in the afternoon on the southwest coast of Louisiana. And different species have all kinds of different patterns. Some species cross over the Gulf, others go around. Some are more Caribbean. The little blackpoll warbler is perhaps one of the most spectacular migrants in North America. It's a little 12-gram bird. It's like the equivalent of 5 pennies, and it makes a 3-day flight over the Atlantic and Caribbean. And often it's a single flight when they arrive on the coast of Venezuela and Colombia. It's absolutely incredible that they can do that. And the way that birds actually find their way through the world is incredibly complex, and again, depending on when they do it, and is variable. So some birds can use polarized light. So if you've ever worn the sunglasses with polarized coatings, and you tilt your head back and forth, you can see the color of the sky change. Birds have that built in, and they can see polarized light and use that as a way of directing themselves into their based on the angle of the sun. They can use stars. A lot of birds are thought to be able to use the magnetic field of the earth in various combinations. Things like cranes that migrate as social groups often learn the migration routes from their predecessors, from their parents, from their cousins, their uncles. So once they've done 1 or 2 of those migrations, they pass that learned migration route on to their young. But in terms of how songbirds do it, this was a really interesting study done on a European robin. You can put them in a cage during the migration season, and at night, they will start to go in the direction that they think they should be going to migrate. So in spring, they're going to go north-northeast, and you can put like either a mechanical or paper sort of system. The early days, it was just sort of a paper system with a coating, and you could actually see where the bird is sort of bouncing off the side of the cage, trying to migrate. And it's going in a very particular direction, right? This is not random. It knows where it wants to go. But if you cover the right eye and leave the left eye open, the bird suddenly becomes disoriented. You do nothing else to the bird, just cover its right eye, leave its left eye open. It has no idea where to go. But if you cover the opposite eye, or the left eye, and leave the right eye open, it knows where to go. So there's something within the right eye that is detecting something we can't see or feel that tells it where to go, that tells it which direction to migrate. And what we think is going on is it has to do with the Earth's magnetic field, right? So depending on where you are on the Earth, the angle of the magnetic field changes. And the question is, how do you detect that if you don't have a compass, right? If you're a bird. Well, it turns out birds in their right eye, at least many songbirds, seem to have what are called cryptochrome sensors. So we have rods and cones that detect light and dark in different ways. Birds have a whole extra set of sensors in their right eye that detect magnetic fields. It interacts with a little mechanism in their brain, and we think they can actually visualize the magnetic field through these cryptochrome sensors. All the physiology has been worked out, and so if you're looking north versus west versus east, the angle of those magnetic fields become visible and tell you where to go. It's just incredible. So tracking individual birds and learning about their routes is a really powerful way of understanding what they need. So we can look at big, broad range maps, and yeah, they, prothonotary warblers, for example, come down through the Gulf Coast and through Central and South America. But what does an individual bird actually need in order to complete that journey? And only in recent years have we gotten the tools small enough to track some of these migratory birds. So this is a tool that we call a geolocator. This geolocator weighs 1/2 gram. So you would need 1,000 of them to make a pound, essentially. And that geolocator weighs less than 3% of the bird's body weight, which makes it safe for the bird. And all it is a little light stalk that collects light data every 2 minutes, the intensity of light. It attaches to a little computer that logs the data, and it has a little power source, a little battery source. And that battery will last somewhere between 9 months and 12 months. So you put one of these on the bird in the summer, let it do its migration south. That bird will presumably migrate north if it survives. And then you as a researcher have to go out, find that bird, and recapture that bird, and to pull the geolocator off and download the data. And what it does is by figuring out, by measuring the light level, you can estimate when sunrise and sunset occurs on every day of the year. And that allows you to determine the day length, which gives you latitude, and the solar noon gives you longitude. So you can get an approximation of the daily position of one of these small little birds, but it requires recapturing them. So actually the first successful geolocator tracking was done right in Baton Rouge through the Baton Rouge Audubon Society, their Louisiana Bird Observatory program. A graduate student named Jared Wolf decided, let's give 3 a try. And so we caught 3 prothonotary warblers. We attracted them with these nest boxes, and one of the birds immediately dropped its geolocator after we released it. A second bird vanished after we released it. I don't know if it was eaten by a predator or just dispersed or wasn't a local breeder, but there was one bird left with its geolocator that raised its babies, and sometime in the fall it disappeared. It went south. So we waited all winter for that bird to come back, and lo and behold, it did. It actually came back to Bluebonnet Swamp, where we recaptured it and recovered the geolocator. And this was the route that it took. So after leaving Bluebonnet, it staged on the southwestern coast of Louisiana. It crossed the Gulf of Mexico, which was a surprise to us. We thought it might go around. Then it started heading east and actually went all the way over to Cuba for a little while, and then went to Jamaica, where it spent about a month there. So it's now, 3 months or so in migration, a little over that. And then it finally overwintered in northwestern Colombia. In the spring, it made a beeline back up Central America. It left the Yucatan on the night of the 23rd and arrived in Baton Rouge the next day. So this was the first, successful tracking of what an individual prothonotary needs. Imagine all the habitat that a bird like that needs in order to make this journey. What happens if one of those areas gets cleared for development or something else? So with that work, we formed a working group of other prothonotary warbler researchers that deploy geolocators around the country. And we recovered 34 of those over several years, and basically figured out that virtually the entire population is overwintering in northern Colombia, which was something we had no idea before. We figured western birds may be wintering in Central America and eastern birds may be wintering in northern South America, but they concentrate into an area of like 20% of their breeding range on the wintering grounds. And so if you're going to conserve a bird like the prothonotary warbler, this tells you where to put your efforts on the non-breeding grounds. The other thing we were able to do is show the important stopover sites with this. So collectively, this is where most of the individuals were refueling for the next stage of the migration. So pretty powerful stuff. And of course, you can extrapolate that out to all 300 plus birds that are found in Louisiana, right? And it turns out that the Gulf of Mexico is actually really, really, really important for birds all around the continent, not just prothonotary warblers. So we get white pelicans from the Central Flyway, common loons from the Mississippi Flyway, gannets from the Atlantic Flyway, frigate birds from the Caribbean, and then of course a whole suite of species that live here year-round in the Gulf. And so the Gulf Coast is really one of the premier bird watching areas in the country, and one of the most important conservation areas in the country because of its connectivity to birds around the continent. And our wetlands, our coastal wetlands, built by the Mississippi River Delta, has incredible numbers of birds. We host something like 3/4 of the Western Hemisphere population of sandwich tern just in Louisiana. And really, most of those are on just a few nesting islands. More than half of the global population of seaside sparrows are in coastal Louisiana. This is something to really be proud of. This is something to really like show the world just how incredibly important this place is. Mottle duck, brown pelican, royal tern, clapper rail, Wilson's plover. These are birders' birds. These are birds that birders around the country want to see, and we have more of them than anywhere else. So really, really, really important coastline. You can also look at it in terms of just the number of colonial wading birds of the rookeries. So some of the more famous ones, there used to be the one at Audubon Park, right? There's of course Lake Martin, but there are many of them all around coastal Louisiana, and just the density of them is really uncomparable. You can see, obviously a high density in Florida Bay and the Everglades. Parts of Texas have a lot of importance as well, but southeastern Louisiana in particular is really important. And same with the seabirds, pelicans, skimmers, terns, really, really important offshore Louisiana. But of course, as many of you likely know, our coast is suffering, right? We're seeing massive rates of erosion, and this includes the places that those birds depend on. So this was a really important royal tern in Brown Pelican Island in Terrebonne Bay, south of Cocodrie. In 2006 or so, the state of Louisiana built a rock ring around it to try to stabilize it, try to prevent it from eroding away. Unfortunately, they didn't really understand fully the dynamics of what was happening there. And just within the next 5 years, you can see the rock ring, and the island had shifted completely outside of it. The sand had moved because of wind and wave action. And it's now only a shoal. There's no nesting birds on this island anymore. And you sort of replicate that over many, many islands. And then suddenly, in the example of brown pelicans, we've gone from 14 to 7 nesting islands in the state in the last 15 years. And this map, it gives you an example of what could happen if we don't do anything in terms of restoration. So all these dark blue areas were once land that would convert to open water because of erosion, sea level rise, so on and so forth. And this is all bird habitat. This is the 50% to 70% of the world's seaside sparrows are found in places like this. So coastal land loss is obviously a huge deal for New Orleans, for the people of New Orleans, but it is also a wildlife and environmental crisis. And of course, lots of work is being done to address it. For the first time ever, next year, CPRA is projected to spend $1 billion with the B in coastal restoration. The BP money is flowing, the BP settlement dollars are flowing, and we're seeing massive investments in coastal restoration. So this is the example of the Caminata Headland, which is just west of Grand Isle. You can kind of see Grand Isle right up there in the northern, the upper part of the picture. But this was a 13-mile stretch of beach that was restored. It cost upwards of $200 million. And they're doing a phase 3 of the marsh restoration in the back, which just started a few weeks ago. So lots of good work, and we know that birds are using it. Audubon staff are working with graduate students out there to study how birds are responding to these restoration projects, and so we're seeing birds like least terns using these restoration sites. Birds like Wilson's plovers are using these restoration sites, and they're benefiting from the increased elevation that the restoration is providing, so they're less likely to get washed out by storms. Of course, some of the risks that we still have for some of these birds are just because they do nest on beaches and they lay their eggs in the sand, that puts them at risk to human disturbance. So in places like Grand Isle and Elmer's Island, and a lot of places in Southwest Louisiana, we have to do a lot of work to try to protect the more sensitive nesting areas. And we're always looking for volunteers to do that. So next spring, once COVID is in our rearview mirrors, hopefully, and the birds come back to nest, we'll be looking for volunteers to help us with this work and steward these birds and inform beachgoers why there's areas that are set aside for the birds in the state park and owners. And of course, these are some of the cutest babies in the world, right? These little Wilson's plovers are just downright adorable. No one will disagree with you that they're worth protecting. These sites are also really important stopover sites for migratory shorebirds. These are like sandpipers and plovers. The bird in the upper left here is a beautiful one called a ruddy turnstone, which we see in migration. And you know, the productivity of these coastal wetlands, these mud flats, these sandbars, really host impressive numbers of these shorebirds. And one of them in particular is this incredible long distance migrant, the red knot, and they come through every spring, fall, and it's like a 10,000 mile one-way trip from the Arctic breeding grounds to the wintering grounds in southern South America. But unfortunately, you know, like so many of these other birds at risk, sandpipers and plovers are largely declining. More than half of the 50 plus species are declining. One of them has actually gone extinct. It turns out there's actually one species that has an increasing population. And so we'll wake you back up and put in your answer in the chat box. Which species of sandpiper or plover do you think is having an increased population? If you don't know, that's okay too. And I know not all of you are birders, but there are a few birders in there. Let's see what you think. I think somebody has seen this question before. Hey, Becky. So Becky Lloyd is right. It is the piping plover. This is an endangered species. This is a bird that was down to a few thousand pairs in the 1980s. And the reason why it's increasing is because of those stewardship efforts of protecting nesting areas across the Atlantic and beaches in the Midwest, like the Great Lakes and some of the sandbars of the rivers. So we know that we can, you know, through stewardship and the protection of nesting areas, that we can bring some of these birds back. And if you couple that with restoration, we have a really good chance of preventing more of these declines. So the other thing, you know, I'm going to kind of get away from the coastal restoration spiel and just sort of talk a little bit more about the diversity of birds in Louisiana. So obviously the coasts are really interesting and important for lots of reasons, but the rest of Louisiana is really interesting too. And for me, like what brought me to Louisiana, I was raised in Pittsburgh. I came down here for graduate school to go to LSU. What brought me here were the piney woods and the Henslow sparrow that winters in those piney woods. And this bird in the upper left is a Henslow sparrow. You can actually see the band on the bird. That was one of my study birds. It's a wonderful habitat. It's fire dependent. It's very threatened, but it's got this wonderful plant community. If you ever have the opportunity to go to places like Lake Ramsey on the North Shore, or Sandy Hollow, or Big Branch, there are birds that you'll find in those kinds of habitats that aren't found anywhere else. It's a very, very unique ecosystem. And so it's not just the North Shore, but it's also like the Kisatchie Forest, or only national forest in the state of Louisiana, has a lot of really healthy piney woods and a very healthy red-cockaded woodpecker population, which is another endangered species. So yeah, I mean, it's just a really, really beautiful habitat. One of the other cool things about Louisiana, and New Orleans is a great place for this, are the kinds of hummingbirds that we get in the winter. So if you keep your feeders out year round, you have the possibility of attracting something very different from a ruby-throated hummingbird, which is our normal bird from the east. In the winter, we get things like rufous hummingbird, broad-billed hummingbird, or buff-bellied hummingbird. All these species from the western United States, and some of these are even tropical, come into Louisiana in the winter. And so with a little bit of cover, a little bit of hummingbird flowers in garden, and a couple of feeders, you're very, very likely to attract one of these little gems to your place. And Louisiana is also really well positioned for finding oddballs. There are several species that are just totally outrageous that have been found here. So this flamingo, I think, is a really cool story. If you look closely to their legs, you can actually see there's a band, and both of these birds are banded. Well, the one on the left, it turns out that band identified it as a bird that was banded as a chick on the Yucatan Peninsula. It was born in the wild and actually showed up in Texas and then moved up to Louisiana, where it was photographed over several years. The bird on the right is also banded and identifies the bird as an escapee from the Wichita Zoo. And for whatever reason, that Chilean flamingo hooked up with this American flamingo for several years, and we're seen moving back and forth between Texas and Louisiana. So you never know what could show up here. You know, this is a Jabiru stork that's found in the tropics. It's the only state record, but this is the time of year to be looking for them. Lots of cool stuff. And as I mentioned before too, the sheer number of birds for even, you know, for people who aren't serious about bird watching can be really spectacular. And just a real hook to see. Obviously, you know, the amount of ducks that we get here in the winter, but also the migratory birds, the breeding birds. It's just, Louisiana is so special for birds. And at the Audubon Society, we've identified different parts of the state as either continental or global important bird areas. So these are places that support at least 1% of the global population of a species of concern. So you can see most of coastal Louisiana is important. I mentioned the Kisatchie forests because of the red-cockaded woodpeckers and Henslow sparrow abundances. Yeah, so just really, really lots of neat places to look for birds in Louisiana. And community scientists like yourselves can make a difference, participate in eBird, allow, you know, researchers to be able to use your bird watching data for science to understand how birds are doing. There's the Audubon Christmas bird count, which is coming up this winter, starting in December. If you've never done one, it's easy to hook you up with an experienced birder. Obviously with COVID, that creates a few wrinkles, but hopefully we'll have that all figured out. So there's just lots of great ways of participating. There's a great backyard bird count in February over the Valentine's Day weekend. So you can show your love for birds by counting them and contributing your data to eBird. Lots of resources out there. There's several other experts on this call. Jane Patterson is the president of the Baton Rouge Audubon Society. Joelle Finley. Are you still president of Crescent Bird Club? I mean, she's involved in a lot of bird stuff going on in New Orleans. There's these online resources, the Louisiana Ornithological Society. It's a very active group. LSU has a wonderful bird resource page. There are Facebook groups that can help you identify birds. You have any question about a bird, people are quick to answer. Join your local bird club. There's the Orleans Audubon Society and the Crescent Bird Club right here in New Orleans. And there's bird clubs all around the state to get involved in. They do bird walks. They have various lectures about birds. So all very active groups. You can get involved in your local nonprofit conservation organizations or your state or federal organizations that are involved in bird conservation or bird habitat conservation. If you can't volunteer and you have the opportunity to donate, you know, this work is vital for ensuring that birds have a future in Louisiana. And I will end it there. So these are the ways to contact me. I tweet, right? National Audubon Society, we were the original tweeters before there was such thing as Twitter. You know, visit our webpage, see more about what we do. If you have any interest in participating in any of our programs in any way, feel free to reach out to me. If you have any questions about birds anytime, feel free to reach out to me. If you have questions about leaf hoppers or moths, I'm actually getting into leaf hoppers and moths too. So I'm not just a bird guy anymore. So yeah, I will, if there's time, if there's interest, I can, happy to open it up to a conversation, questions, flamingo love stories. Kristen asks if e-birding in my backyard, is it okay to put out bird food as usual? Yes, don't change anything. If anything, just put it in your comments that you feed birds. That's a nice note to add. Yeah, someone asked about the Purple Martin project. So that is, we submitted a grant to get some funding to really try to launch that. Hopefully we will get funding. We'll know in October. The vision, the long-term vision, is to provide resources to educate Purple Martin landlords about best management practices that they can implement at their house, at their Martin house, to benefit the Purple Martins. So obviously Purple Martins have a lot of challenges with invasive species like starlings and house sparrows taking over their nesting sites. So if you leave that, if you don't manage that, if you don't take your Purple Martin house down at this time of year, the sparrows and the starlings continue to nest, and they will take over the box and prevent the martins from coming back in the future. They can also take out the eggs when the martins are nesting. So invasive species management is a big challenge. We know that Purple Martins are declining across the range. They're declining even more rapidly in Louisiana than most other places. So it's a pretty important place. And there's a lot of interest in Purple Martins. Almost every neighborhood has a Purple Martin house. I'm not sure how many are used anymore, but yeah, so it's a way, we want to provide that kind of programming, some online resources, and work with local school groups and other kinds of groups to actually put out Martin houses. So ideally we'd have some funding to actually supply Martin houses, and to improve existing Martin houses that need to be maintained. So we'll see if we get the funding for that. We're going to really ramp it up in October and November. Okay. So let's see who won the bet. How many people are still here?
Yeah, so we actually, right before questions started, we had 54. So 54 people. The entire.
Joelle was right. Well, it's still 51. So kudos. Thank you guys for hanging in there with me.
Yeah, and you guys, Audubon of Louisiana, and just the Audubon Society in general, on their website, they've got all kinds of webinars and resources and stuff. And right now with COVID going on, we're counting those as CE hours. So, feel free to watch as many videos about birds as you'd like. But yeah, that was a fantastic talk. Thank you so much, Erik. Let's see. Oh,
sure, and we got
one more question.
I should have plugged a couple of those talks. Jane Patterson is giving one on hummingbirds. I don't know if she can provide some information on that. It's coming up, I think, on the 14th, like this Friday. So pretty quick. And then we have a talk with Bill Fontenot next a week from today on the 18th, a week from yesterday. So on the 18th, Bill Fontenot will be giving a presentation about native plants for birds. So talking about his long-term research and understanding the relationship between plant fruiting and which birds use them, as a way to think about how to put different kinds of plants in your yard that would benefit birds.
Hey, this is Jane.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, Jane.
So the 2 hummingbird programs are going to be tomorrow, the 13th at 7 p.m. And then Monday, the 17th at 7 p.m. Both of the Zoom programs are full at 100 people each, but I'm going to be broadcasting it on the Baton Rouge Audubon Facebook page as well. So if you didn't get in to the Zoom session, you should be able to watch it online on the Facebook Live session for both the 13th and the 17th at 7 p.m.
Awesome. Yeah, here I'm trying to see if I can get that link and put it in the chat for everybody. Audubon Society. Ah. All right. Yep. All right, you guys, I'm going to put the link for the Baton Rouge Audubon Society Facebook page in the chat, and that is where y'all can go for the hummingbird talk. Let's see, I had one more question. I look like, where is it? About the flamingos. That was a popular one. Oh, I lost it. Let's see. When was the last time a flamingo pair were spotted in Louisiana?
Oh, man. All the years blend together. I want to say it was probably like 2014. I can look it up real quick.
Awesome. All right.
Yeah, it's been a while, unfortunately. I think the Chilean one was seen for 1 or 2 years solo after the wild American flamingo disappeared.
Mm-hmm.
So it probably met a sad fate.
Yeah.
But it was fun while it lasted.
Right. And I remember hearing stories of sightings way back when, and people were freaking out.
Yeah, no, it was a huge deal because we see, I mean, there are flamingo reports in Louisiana from time to time, but they're unbanded. And so there's no way of proving or disproving that they're like an escapee from a zoo or collection somewhere. So really that banded one is the only proven wild flamingo ever to be found in Louisiana. Oh yeah, it was even older. 2011, it looks like.
Oh, wow.
Was the last report.
Oh, someone said, this is Nicole, she said someone she knows saw a flock of flamingos in St. Landry Parish a few weeks ago. So yeah, they're
probably those are roseate spoonbills.
Yeah, they get often confused.
Yeah, it's easy for people to see a pink bird, and especially in flight, and sort of get them mixed up. But on the plus side, we call spoonbills Cajun flamingos, so she's not all wrong.
There you go. Different kind of flamingo. Common name. I love it. All right, well, it looks like we're good on questions. I don't see, oh wait, did I speak too soon? Okay, it looks like we've got a couple of other chats going on in a couple of other events going on in the chats too, so y'all check those out. But yeah, I think that's it for us. Let's see, check my notes. Well, obviously, thanks again, Erik. That was amazing, wonderful as always, and thanks to everyone who participated. I'm going to give you guys a quick few pointers for reporting your hours. So don't forget to log your CE hours. Tonight we're going to count it for an hour and a half. And then just make sure when you list it to list it as other instead of, don't do it as general body CE, because this is not one of our general body meetings. So we want our reports to be accurate. And then just type in All About Birds as the title, or All About Birds Seminar. And then let's see what else. Oh, for volunteer. So for your volunteer hours for this one, if you guys are going to do eBird or INAT, again, Erik's a great resource. I know, you guys are more than welcome to reach out to myself at the volunteers with an s.lmngno@gmail.com. And then when you're recording those volunteer hours, just put, again, that other title, and then put eBird or INAT, whichever one you choose, Wednesday Seminar Vol as your title. And just put species or your list number or whatever you've got in the notes section of that, just so we have a good, nice, thorough, robust record of hours. I think that's all we've got. I'm going to double check the chat one more time. Let's see. lots of great to hear you talk, Erik, and thanks everybody. Happy birding. So yeah, that was fantastic. Thank you guys so much. And next week we'll have Lauren Hemard with her nature journaling talk. So y'all have a great evening and thanks for coming by. All right, guys. Thanks again, Erik. That was great. Bye, guys.
Good night, everyone.